In this lesson, we're going to look at how to prove parallel lines using congruent triangles. So if you recall, we have lots of different reasons that we can use to prove lines are parallel. So for example, congruent alternate interior angles, congruent alternate exterior angles, congruent corresponding angles, those all prove parallel lines. As well as supplementary same side interior or supplementary same side exterior angles would all prove parallel lines. So basically what we need to do is if we're given a situation where we have two triangles and we want to prove that sides of those triangles are parallel, if we can find a pair of congruent corresponding angles or alternate interior, alternate exterior angles that are congruent, then that would make those lines parallel. So what we do is if we prove the triangle's congruent first, so if we follow these steps, prove that the triangles are congruent, then we can use CP/CTC to get that special pair of angles congruent. And then from there, once we have those angles are congruent, then we can say that the lines are parallel. You can also do this with supplementary, but that's going to be less common, like if you get your supplementary same side interior angles or supplementary same side exterior. So what we're going to do, let's start off with our givens here. So we have AB and CD bisect each other. So I'm going to go ahead and write that out. So I have AB and CD bisect each other. And if I look at my picture, so here's my given, that means right away, if these are bisecting each other, it means that both segments are getting bisected. So it means that CE and ED are congruent, as well as AE and BE. And then if I look at where I'm trying to go, I'm trying to get AC parallel to BD. So basically what that means is if I can prove angles that are alternate interior or corresponding or alternate exterior angles congruent, then these lines would be parallel, or these segments would have to be parallel. So if you look, the angles in the triangle here, if I look at angle C and angle D, let me just highlight this for a second, then I'm going to delete it. But if I look at these lines and I think about this as my transversal, if I could prove angles C and D congruent, which are in these two triangles, if I could prove that those are congruent and they are in the interior of those lines that I'm trying to prove parallel, alternate sides of the transversal, so they're alternate interior angles, if those are congruent, then I can say that these lines must be parallel. So that's really where I want to head with this. So if I can get that these angles inside of these two triangles are congruent, then I can say that the lines must be parallel because congruent alternate interior angles imply parallel lines. So what I want to do to start here is to actually prove that this triangle is congruent to triangle BED, because if I prove that those triangles are congruent, then I can use these alternate interior angles, C and D. I can prove that those have to be congruent by CP/CTC because they're congruent corresponding, or they're corresponding parts of congruent triangles, so that would make them congruent. Then I have my parallel lines. So back to where I need to start, I need to get the congruent triangles. So the congruent triangles I need to get by one of our 5 congruence theorems. So I have the bisect, and I've already marked it, so let's go ahead and write about that. So I can say that CE is congruent to DE. And I also said that AE was congruent to BE because of the bisector. And that's because a bisector implies 2 congruent parts. Or you could say a segment bisector implies 2 congruent segments. So that's going to give me my 2 sets of sides, and then I really don't have any other givens, but if I look at my diagram here, I have vertical angles. So I'm just going to call those angles 1 and 2. So that's just going to kind of be a floater reason off by itself. So angle 1 and angle 2, those have to be congruent because vertical angles are congruent. And then from there, I have side, angle, side for these 2 triangles. So I'm going to prove congruent triangles by side, angle, side. That's my first step here. So now I can go ahead and connect these and say that triangle CEA is congruent to triangle DEB. Again, I'm paying attention to the order of my letters here to make sure that the corresponding parts are lining up when I write my congruence statement. And this is by side angle side. So just to verify, I have one side here, my angle is right there, and then my other pair of sides is right here. So I have all three things mentioned in my proof. From there, I can now say that since I have the congruent triangles, well, then all of their corresponding parts are congruent. So I can say that angle C and angle D must now be congruent. Notice that I did not mark those yet. I just put stars until I was able to prove that they were congruent from side angle side. That's important because you don't want to mark them too soon and then use them as congruent parts if you haven't proven them yet. So I always like to just put a star or something in there until I've actually proven that they're congruent. So this is by CPCTC. Keep in mind, I could have done the same thing with angle A and angle B. I could have said that those were congruent angles and those would also be congruent alternate interior angles. Which being congruent would prove parallel lines. So you just pick and choose which ones you want to use, which pair, C and D or A and B. And then from there, since those angles are congruent, now I can say that the lines must be parallel. So I can say AC must be parallel to BD, because if we have congruent alternate interior angles, this implies parallel lines. So notice that I started with the congruent alternate interior angles. That led me to the parallel lines. Make sure you remember to say the congruent part because you can have alternate interior angles and not have parallel lines. So just be careful. They have to be congruent in order to prove that those lines are parallel. So let's try another one. So that one's all set. So let's look at this one. So the first thing I'm going to look at is where am I trying to go with it and also what's given to me and how we're going to go about getting there. So I'm trying to prove AE is parallel to FC. So right away I'm thinking, okay, if I have to prove parallel lines, that means I have to have a pair of congruent angles that are either alternate interior, corresponding, alternate exterior. I have to have one of those special pairs of angles. Or even the supplementary. But like I said, that's kind of hard to do in a proof to get the supplementary. So really focus on trying to get a pair of congruent alternate interior, congruent alternate exterior, or congruent corresponding. So then I look at what's given to me and what triangles I could use to get that special pair of angles. So I'm given that angle 1 and angle 2 are congruent. I have DE and BF. I have AD and BC. So right away, I can see that if I prove these two triangles right here, AED and BCF, I already have that those triangles are congruent by side angle side, just from the givens. So then I'm looking at, okay, well, if these are my, let me go ahead and extend these. So if these are the lines I'm trying to prove parallel, this could be my possibility for a transversal. And if I look at what's in common between this two parallel or these two lines in the transversal and my triangles, I'm right away, I'm looking at angles 3 and 4. So 3 and 4 to me, I see that they both belong to the triangles. I don't have them marked already as congruent. They are shared in this diagram, and they happen to be on the opposite sides of the transversal in the exterior. So those are going to be alternate exterior angles. And because they belong to these congruent triangles, that's going to make those congruent angles. And then if I have congruent alternate exterior angles, that makes the lines parallel. So that's really where I need to go with this proof. So we're going to prove that the triangles are congruent by side angle side. And then we'll use 3 and 4 by CPCTC, and then we can say that the lines are parallel. So let's go ahead and write it up. So I'm going to write all my givens out. I'm going to keep these givens separated because they don't really connect. There's no connection here, or nothing in common between them. So I have DE is congruent to BF, and then AD is congruent to BC. And then these are my pieces that I need. These are the three things I need to get the congruent triangles. So those are going to come together and prove triangle AED is congruent to, again, paying attention to the letters here, CFB would match up. So that's going to be by side angle side. And then from there, let's just make sure we have everything that we're saying we have. So we have a set of sides, we have the set of angles, and we have the set of sides in our proof. So then from there, since we have the triangles congruent by side angle side, now I can say that angles 3 and 4 must be congruent by CPCTC. Corresponding parts of congruent triangles are congruent. I can go ahead and mark those now in my picture now that I've mentioned that they're congruent. And then from there, well, if those are congruent, that must make those lines parallel. So I'm just going to connect this off to the side here. So AE is parallel to FC because now I have congruent alternate exterior angles, which implies parallel lines. So again, the order of this reason is important. You were starting with the congruent alternate exterior angles, so that leads you to the parallel lines. And don't forget the congruent part as well, because again, you can have alternate exterior angles and have lines that are not parallel, because that's just the vocab term. In order to be congruent, the lines have to be parallel. Or if the angles are congruent, then the lines must be parallel. So that's it. So again, this process is the same. If you're ever trying to prove parallel, the only way to do that is by using a special pair of angles to do so. And again, most commonly, you're always going to prove that the angles are congruent versus doing the supplementary ones. So get your congruent triangles so that you can get your congruent angles so that you can get your parallel line. So there's your process. So go ahead and get some key ideas written down and try to check your understanding, and we will talk about those in class tomorrow.